Greetings everyone, hope all of you are having an absolutely fantastic day. Let's get back into Dark Envoy, and this time we'll dive into the Adept class. I made Kayla an Adept and absolutely did not regret it. The class is fantastic. To show you briefly my breakdown as far as attribute points, I definitely put the majority of my focus on power, which is going to increase her max mana and skill power as well, so to make sure that those magic abilities hit like a truck. And then you also want a lot of points in mastery to ensure that your mana regeneration increases enough for you to be able to regularly use your powers during combat. And then you want a few powers into speed to help with the cooldown reduction. This is definitely going to make your rotation for different powers become much better. And I would say it's worth enchanting some of your gear to have additional cooldown reduction, because it'll be a while before you'll be in a position where you can really sink a lot of points into this skill. Most of them are probably going to need to be tied up between power and mastery. So looking at the actual talents, at the top is Mana Pool, which is a passive, and it increases your maximum mana by up to 10%. Without question, this is absolutely something you'll want. In fact, it's probably something you should pick up right at the very beginning to help ensure you can cycle through all of your spells easily. Next, we have Ice Bolts, which is going to cast 3 ice bolts in a cone, each of them dealing 63 ice damage and inflicting frostbite and vulnerable. This skill also has synergy, so if enemies are already frostbitten, they'll be frozen instead. Frostbitten enemies have their movement and attack speed decreased by 33%. Frozen enemies get a frost shield that prevents them from performing any actions. In addition, any damage that's dealt to the enemy is also dealt to the frost shield, so you can potentially do enough damage where they'll become unfrozen but still alive, or obviously you could kill them while they are actually frozen. The cone is actually really large, so it's easy to hit enemies with this as long as they're close enough, and it also combos nicely with Freeze Spike, which deals 168 frost damage in a 3-meter area to enemies, and it'll also create a surface that lasts for 10 seconds and inflicts frostbite. This skill has synergy with enemies that are vulnerable, and it causes them to be frozen. Obviously, Ice Bolts causes enemies to be vulnerable as well, so this basically gives you 2 different ways in order to potentially freeze enemies. I honestly like Freeze Spike a little bit more than Ice Bolts, because Ice Bolts is a cone that comes out from your character. So if enemies are beyond the range of that cone, you have no choice but to try to navigate your character up further first and then try to use this ability again. Whereas Freeze Spike is an area of effect, so even if enemies are far out, it'll still just allow you to select the talent and click on that space, and then your character will just automatically move up to wherever they need to and cast the skill. So basically, Freeze Spike is a little bit easier to use than Ice Bolts is. You also can only use Ice Bolts if there's an enemy directly in the cone. So you can't precast it when you know an enemy is going to come around the corner, or when you know they will be within range of the cone very shortly. They have to already be in range before you'll be allowed to select this skill. Next up is Fire Apprentice, which costs 1 summon point. You get 2 summon points, so you can cast Fire Golem 2 times, and this is going to summon a golem that is untargetable for 60 seconds. It's going to follow you around, and it takes 50% of the damage dealt to the summoner. In addition, there's synergy that the golem gains additional unit levels equal to the number of nearby enemies with an elemental status. So essentially, the more you freeze enemies, the more levels this golem is going to get. It's also a ranged unit, so if enemies are in range, it will go ahead and attack them. And it has HP and damage that scales with your skill power. This is obviously fantastic because it's going to significantly limit the amount of damage your Adept is going to take. When you have 2 of them out at the same time, your character will be virtually invulnerable, at least until one of the summons goes down. This also pairs nicely with Mana Shell, which is going to protect your caster with a barrier that grants 210 magic shield and lasts for 30 seconds or until destroyed. When the barrier is destroyed, it's going to explode and push away all enemies within 2 meters with weak force, inflicting knockdown. Knockdown prevents an enemy from taking any action, and they will take 25% more damage from weapon attacks. So basically, this is a fantastic way to make sure your Adept is protected. There are 2 upgrade paths for this skill. Mana Shield will significantly increase how powerful your magic shield is, and it also makes the force, which knocks enemies down once your barrier is destroyed, a strong force, as opposed to the weak force it is on the original skill. This is the way that I prefer to level up this skill, and it's going to help ensure your Adept is more protected. Your other option is Mana Surge, which is going to cause the shield to give you additional weapon damage and skill power, and your attacks inflict Confused for 30 seconds, and this status chance increases if you're using two-handed weapons. My Adept does not focus on manual attacks, so I don't feel like this is worthwhile, but if you are running something like a Battle Mage, obviously this is an option worth considering. Personally, I ran Mana Shell and Fire Apprentice at the same time to give my Adept maximum protection. And the reason for that is I liked having this character right in the middle of where all the heavy action was, so it would be easy to use the cone powers such as Ice Bolts or Prismatic Flares. And so consequently, I found it very beneficial to have as much protection running as I possibly could. The next skill is the passive Weapon Overcharge, which for every 11.8 seconds, your weapon is overcharged and deals additional damage with the next attack. This effect scales with your skill power. I obviously didn't use this because I was focused on actually using magic talents, not on basic attacks, so this didn't help. The next is another passive skill power boost. While below 50% health, gain an additional 20% skill power, or at the most 30% skill power. I actually didn't choose this either because, again, I focused on my Adept being as invulnerable as possible. Basically, every time my shell went down or one of my summons became unavailable, my first priority was getting this spun back up. So it was very, very rare that my Adept all of a sudden got clobbered, and this wouldn't be all that useful for me. Next is another passive, Affinity Resist. You'll gain 15% resistance to fire and cold damage. Because there are other passives here that I didn't see value in, I went on ahead and picked this up because it tied in with me wanting my Adept to be as hardy as possible, and I didn't regret it until later on when I felt like there were other passives that worked well also. Next is yet another passive, Weapon Boost. Gain 15% weapon damage, but attacks cost -1 mana. Obviously, this is not something that I used. I don't focus on weapon attacks, and I want the mana cost for my skills to be as low as possible. Fire Weapons imbues the weapons of all allies within 20 meters to deal burn damage and inflict burn and shaken, and there's going to be additional damage and status chance if you're using two-handed weapons. Burned enemies experience fire damage every second, and this increases per level. Shaken enemies have their movement speed reduced by 20%. This is actually a pretty cool way to put some additional damage on party members if you have a couple of them that are focused on regular attacks. So I ran with 2 rangers. Putting fire on their weapons was a great way to give them some additional damage. I didn't put this skill on this particular character because she was focused on bombing enemies, but we're going to get to the Summoner Adept in a minute when we go over specializations, and I did put this option on her because I felt like it made sense for her to buff the entire party. And then last for the base skills is Firewall, which is going to conjure a wall of flames in a 12-meter drawn path that deals burn damage to all enemies and inflicts shaken. The burning surface remains for 6 seconds, dealing additional burn damage per second and inflicting burn on enemies. There's synergy if enemies are vulnerable. The surface deals additional burn damage per second to those particular enemies. This is actually pretty cool, especially if you're able to choke enemies into one particular spot. I didn't use it that much because I actually preferred Meteor Strike, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it's definitely a worthy option to have. Alright, so that's all the base skills for Adept. Now we're going to move into the specializations. And for this character, I went with the Elementalist specialization, which is all about using elements to destroy enemies and damage them. So the first skill is a passive, Elemental Siphon. Gain 5% lifesteal for each equipped weapon, dealing elemental damage. Again, this is not something that would particularly help me. I'm not focused on weapon damage, and it's rare that my Adept is losing a bunch of health. Next up is Prismatic Flares. Cast 3 prismatic projectiles at enemies in a cone, each dealing over 100 damage and inflicting vulnerable. Each projectile chooses fire, cold, or poison damage type to match its target's lowest elemental resistance. This skill has 2 upgrade paths. Prismatic Bolts is going to significantly increase the damage that each projectile does. Prismatic Spikes causes each projectile to do less damage, but you cast 5 of them instead of 3, and depending upon what element you choose to use, you'll have different effects. So fire will burn and confuse enemies, poison will cause enemies to become poisoned and confused, and cold will cause enemies to become frostbitten and confused. I actually use this to trigger some of the synergies that other companions have, and I didn't regret it. This skill absolutely melts enemies, since of course it's specifically targeting whatever element they have the lowest resistance against. The next skill is Elemental Room, which is going to conjure a room for 20 seconds, granting you an additional 20% elemental resistance and 15% skill power. And actually, it's not just for you, it's also for allies that are standing inside of it. If an enemy moves onto it, the rune explodes for cold damage, and it's going to inflict shatter resistance and freeze them. If the enemy is vulnerable, it's going to still inflict shatter resistance, but it's also going to inflict freeze for 8 seconds as opposed to 4 seconds. Shatter Resistance 1 decreases all elemental resistances by 25% except Chaos. Personally, I didn't use this because I'm already using up 2 slots for defensive powers, so I felt like it was a lot to ask using a 3rd slot that essentially serves as a personal buff. I felt like the other 3 slots all needed to be dedicated towards abilities that will actually damage enemies, and so I skipped this, but plus 15% skill power is definitely nice, so it's something to consider. Next is the passive Power Gathering, which allows you to get an additional 3% skill power for each enemy with an elemental status, and this stacks up to 5 times. Definitely went on ahead and picked this up. You should be at least using powers like Ice Bolts and Freeze Spike. You should be putting elemental statuses on enemies all the time, so it shouldn't be a problem in order to be able to trigger this. Next is Immolate. Engulfs target enemy in flames, dealing burn damage plus 2% of target's max HP per second for 3 seconds. It also has a synergy. If cast on vulnerable enemies, when it ends, it'll explode, dealing additional burn damage and inflicting daze on enemies within 3 meters. Daze causes enemies to wander aimlessly in a random direction. This isn't bad, but personally, again, I really like Meteor Strike, and I didn't want to have too many powers that are of just one element, so I decided to skip this. Same deal with Fire Breath, which is going to breathe a stream of fire in a cone, dealing burn damage every 0.5 seconds for 2 seconds and inflicting burn. I decided not to use this because I preferred Meteor Strike. It does have 2 ways you can upgrade. Dark Fire Breath is going to deal additional burn damage, and it's also going to inflict fear on enemies. It also adds a synergy, so if you use this on enemies that are vulnerable, once the effect ends, it will inflict fear for 6 seconds as opposed to the base 3 seconds. Fearful enemies are forced to run away from the source of their fear. The other option is Frost Breath, which is going to change the damage to cold, and it's going to inflict frostbite. Once the effect ends, it'll also freeze enemies within the area. It has a synergy with vulnerable enemies, and once the effect ends, it'll freeze those enemies for 12 seconds as opposed to the base 6 seconds. So all in all, definitely a nice power to be able to use. I decided to use Meteor Strike, but you could absolutely throw this on instead. Next up is Frostfire Blink, which allows you to teleport to a target location, creating a Frost Nova dealing cold damage and inflicting freeze on enemies within the 3 meters of the start, and a Fire Nova, which is going to inflict blind on enemies within 3 meters at the end. It has synergy with vulnerable enemies, so the Frost Nova will inflict freeze for a longer stretch of time on these enemies, and the Fire Nova will inflict blind on these enemies for a longer stretch of time. Weapon attacks from blind enemies always miss the target. Personally, I decided not to use this because it's basically a get out of jail free card, and I felt between Mana Shell and Fire Apprentice, I didn't need something like this on my repertoire. There's probably a case to be made that I could have replaced one of these powers and put Frostfire in there instead, and it'll allow me to avoid dangerous situations while dealing some damage to those enemies at the same time. I think I still prefer my method, but there's something to be said for this skill. Next up is the passive Frost Aegis. Once per combat, when your magic shield is reduced to 0, create a Frost Nova, dealing frost damage and inflicting frostbite on enemies within 3 meters. Might as well pick this. Your magic shell is going to go down all the time, and so you'll be able to trigger this pretty easily. Next is Corrosive Magic. Your attacks inflict 1% resistance strip. On the one hand, you're not going to be using regular attacks all that often, so it's questionable how much you're going to actually trigger this. But on the other hand, it's not like you have all that many good passives to choose from within this class, so I kind of just throw this on there. And then finally, you get Meteor Strike. All enemies within a 3-meter area are slammed with 210 burn damage. This will also create a 5-meter surface that lasts for 8 seconds, dealing burn damage per second and inflicting burn. This has synergy with shaken enemies and will inflict knockdown on them for 8 seconds. This skill has 2 upgrade paths. The Meteor Blast option will significantly increase the fire damage of the initial blast, and it'll increase the amount of time that enemies are knocked down if they were shaken. You can also choose Blizzard, which is going to inflict cold damage every second while inflicting frostbite and vulnerable on enemies within 6 meters. The damage dealt by this skill ignores armor. Personally, I went for Meteor Blast. I absolutely love dropping a huge fire meteor and decimating enemies within a small area. Alright, so looking at my overall build for this character, for most of the game I used the two-handed staff, which is going to give you life drain. Thinking through things now, I would have been better served to use 2 wands, because then I could have enchanted both wands with cooldown reduction, and that would have better served my overall build. As already mentioned, I use Mana Shield and Fire Apprentice in tandem to give the Adept maximum protection. I usually kick the battle off with Freeze Spike, which is going to cause Frostbite on enemies, and then I follow up by getting closer and using Prismatic Spikes to usually wipe out several of the enemies that are still remaining after that first wave of damage. And then in the follow-up, for enemies that are trying to close in on the party, I can absolutely decimate them with Meteor Blast. And then by the time I finish using all 3 of these, one of these powers needs to be reactivated, and I kind of just repeat through the cycle. As far as the passives, I want to go for maximum mana, stacking up skill power higher, getting a Frost Nova Blast when my magic shield is depleted, which again, she's in the middle of where all the action is, so this happens all the time, and then allowing my attacks to inflict 2% resistance strip, which again really isn't all that great, and it's not even being triggered all that often, but it's not like we have a bunch of great passives to choose from here. You could potentially go for lifesteal if you wanted that more. Maybe you're playing on a higher difficulty level and afraid of your character getting shredded. All right, now let's go over the summoner specializations. So I'm getting this from Kim, who is a party member I can only get because I sided with the League during the game. So there's another party member you can get if you side with the Empire, who is, I believe, a sharpshooter under the Ranger class. But starting at the top, we have the Frenzied Summons passive, which allows your summon units to gain 15% weapon damage, but they have negative 25% max HP. Whether or not this works for you depends on how you are using your summons. For me personally, their purpose is to damage enemies, and so I took this because it made the most sense that I just want to get as much damage as possible while they're around. If that's not your purpose and you want your summons to actually tank a little bit for you, then obviously you won't pick this up. But personally, I would go ahead and get it. And then we also have Earthquake. This is going to conjure an earthquake in a 5-meter area, dealing physical damage and inflicting shaking on enemies. And then at the end, there's another quake that deals additional massive physical damage and inflicts knockdown on enemies in the area. There's synergy with enemies that are vulnerable. The initial blast will knock enemies down, as opposed to having to wait until the secondary powerful quake comes. This is nice to have, but I wanted to really lean into her being a summoner, so I ignored this in favor of more of the summoning powers that were available. Next is a passive summoning proficiency. It's going to give you up to 2 additional summon points. This is absolutely necessary so that you can have as many summons out as possible. Next up is Tree of Atonement, which costs 2 summon points. This tree will taunt enemies within 3 meters and inflict shaken. The tree also reflects 40% of the damage that is received. If placed near another tree, they connect with a vine that inflicts immobilize on enemies passing through it. Immobilized enemies are prevented from moving. Now notice the cooldown for this skill is 1.5 seconds, so it makes it very easy for you to throw out trees back to back, which will then taunt and immobilize enemies. I started out using this heavily, and then later on I actually shifted into using a different summon. If you were going to stick with this, then it would absolutely make sense not to take frenzied summons, because you want the HP of your tree to be as high as possible so that they can reflect as much damage as possible. And by the way, that damage reflection, it definitely really works. This tree generates a lot of heat. Enemies will definitely attack it, and I saw enemies die just from attacking it all the time, which was actually pretty cool. This skill has 2 upgrade paths. The Tree of Penance is going to increase the amount of damage that is reflected up to 60%, which is definitely powerful. And the other option is Tree of Inferno, which is going to inflict vulnerable on enemies within 3 meters, and then it periodically bursts with fire, dealing 126 damage and inflicting burn on enemies in the area. Also, if it's connected with another tree, it'll immobilize enemies for 5 seconds as opposed to 3 seconds. So this is really nice if you want to ensure the trees are able to damage enemies, whether enemies actually target the trees or not. I kind of liked having Tree of Penance because it felt like you basically had another tank out onto the field. And even though I always had the engineer with me and liked using the large robots to taunt, they can only cover so large a space. So it was nice having a summoner to basically place a tree in a spot where I didn't have a proper tank or someone taunting to be able to control that part of the battlefield. Next up is Living Vines. This is going to allow you to grow deadly plants that create a surface lasting for 8 seconds, dealing poison damage per second and inflicting poison, vulnerable, and immobilized on enemies that enter the space. Poison enemies have their temporary HP gain from healing lowered by 50%, and they experience poison damage every second. This is interesting, but I wanted my summoner to focus on summoning and taking advantage of that, so personally I skipped this. Call of the Wild casts 3 magic missiles at enemies in a cone, each dealing physical damage and summoning a Spirit Wolf on impact for 6 seconds. The Spirit Wolf is a melee unit, and when they are summoned, they taunt nearby enemies, and the damage scales with the summoner's skill power. Recognize that it does not cost a summon point in order for you to be able to use this. So you can throw out 2 Trees of Atonement using all 4 of your summon points up, and then still be able to use Call of the Wild. I really like this ability. It gave you another great way to be able to control the battlefield and ensure that enemies were targeting people other than your actual party members. Wild Jin costs 2 summon points and summons a Jin for 20 seconds. This is a ranged unit who has a chained lightning ability, and the damage again scales with your skill power. There are 2 upgrade paths for this skill. One of them is the Storm Djinn, which is still a ranged unit and has a chain lightning ability, but this summon will grant you a 25% increase to skill power and HP regeneration. Very nice. The other option is the Flame Djinn, which is a ranged unit, but instead of chain lightning, it has a fireball ability, and when destroyed, it rushes towards the closest enemy and explodes, stunning them. This is really cool from a damage perspective, and I would say that most likely this is the more effective version, but there's just something really cool about having chain lightning, so I always go with the Storm Djinn. And basically once I have this fully unlocked, I transition away from the tree and spend all 4 summoning points into casting the Djinn, and then cast Call of the Wild as often as I can to add even more units onto the field. And again, I don't miss the taunt because I have the engineer using robots that are supposed to taunt most of the people on the field anyway. Next on the list is Arcane Backup, which is a passive and causes you to gain 6% skill power for each of your currently summoned units. Obviously, you want to have as many summons out on the field as possible, so this makes a lot of sense to have. Arcane Scavenger is also a passive. Each time one of your summoned units dies, you're going to restore 1% mana and 1% HP per second for 10 seconds. Might as well throw this on because your summoned units are going to be dying constantly. You might as well get something out of it. And then finally, you have Colossus. This is going to transform you into a Mighty Colossus for 30 seconds, greatly increasing your stats. And on the transformation's end, you are going to suffer Exhausted and Silence. Exhausted decreases your attack speed by 66%, while Silence prevents you from casting any skill. It should also be noted that being a Colossus overrides your regular skills with a set of powerful damage-oriented abilities. There are 2 different upgrades for the Colossus, and I assume the difference between them is within whatever the set of powerful damage-oriented abilities you get. Regardless, I completely ignored this because obviously once you become this Colossus, you don't have the ability to cast any more summons, and being a summoner is the reason why I chose the specialization. Honestly, it's really weird to me that this is supposed to be the creme de la creme of the specialization. It seemed like instead they would give you the ultimate version of another summon, the same way you get for Constructor under Engineer, but for whatever reason that's not the case. I'm not a fan of this skill and I skipped it. Alright, so looking at how I build this out, obviously you still want the passive that's going to give you an additional 10% maximum mana. I got the Frenzied Summon, so I'm getting that additional weapon damage, but you got negative 50% max HP. I also took an additional 2 summon points to make sure I can use as many of those summons as possible, and the Arcane Backup, which is going to increase my skill power by 12% for each of my currently summoned units. Take Mana Shield to give me some protection, and then of course Storm Djinn to give you that ranged damage. We're going to throw out 2 of them, so use all 4 of your summon points on this particular skill. And then we're also going to use Call of the Wilds. It's going to give us a summon that has a taunt, help keep some of the pressure off of us since we're not going to be using Fire Apprentice. And then as I mentioned before, I put fire weapons onto her to add fire damage for both of my ranges, let them carve through enemies even easier. And then if I've cycled through all of these and for whatever reason none of them are available yet and I want to use something else, I've got Freeze Spike and I can go ahead and just throw that out to help a little bit with the damage. And that's pretty much how I have her set up. The last specialization is Combat Medic. As I mentioned during the impressions video, not the biggest fan of this specialization since it is really focused on healing, and I don't feel like this is the type of game where you actually need a dedicated healer, but it's here, so we'll go ahead and go through it. First skill is a passive dedication. Each time you cast a skill, gain 15% power for 5 seconds. That is fantastic. You should absolutely be casting skills constantly. No question here, you're definitely going to want to go ahead and pick this up. The next skill is Toxin Spill. Spreads a toxic ground in a 12-meter drawn path that lasts for 6 seconds, dealing poison damage and inflicting slow, confused, and berserk. Very nice if you want to put a bunch of statuses on enemies in order to trigger other things that your party does, you're probably going to want to go ahead and consider this. Next is Medic Golem. This is going to summon an untargetable golem for 20 seconds that follows the summoner and takes 50% of the damage dealt, just like your Fire Apprentice. But instead of attacking the enemy, it's going to heal the most wounded ally in range for 60 HP. And the healing and HP scale with the summoner's skill power. So this is basically going to allow you to have you could have two creatures, right? Because you get 2 summon points, so you could have 2 medic golems that basically run around and heal allies who are experiencing a lot of damage. Definitely not bad to have. There are 2 upgrade paths for this skill. Medic Golem is going to increase the HP that is healed for the most wounded ally, so it's going to increase it up to 80. Very nice. And then Toxic Golem is going to actually attack the same target as a summoner, and when it's destroyed, it's going to run towards the closest enemy and explode, dealing poison damage and inflicting poison on all enemies within 3 meters. Very, very nice. If you wanted to make this more combat oriented, but sticking with the theme, I think it probably makes more sense to just go ahead and go with Medic Golem. Next is Medical Emergency, a passive that allows you to gain 15% movement speed and 10% cooldown reduction for each nearby ally below 25% HP. I don't think you should really be counting on your entire party being decimated, so I would say skip this. Next is Channel Light. Channels a healing beam at the target ally, healing them for 70 HP per second for 5 seconds. The caster is immobile for the duration. Again, I don't think it makes sense to really focus on healing, and even more importantly, being immobile is never a good thing. This is a game where damage comes up constantly and you want to really be able to move around, so personally I skip this. It makes more sense with Medic Golem because you don't have to manually control that, right? You got these 2 little creatures and they'll just figure out, all right, this is the most wounded ally, let's go ahead and take care of them. But for something manual like this, I don't like it. Healing Crystals is another summon, and it's going to transfer its HP to allies within 3 meters, healing them for 20 HP per second until depleted and granting 20% elemental resistance. And as you can see in the statistics over to the right, this creature has 400 HP, so there's quite a lot of healing that the crystal could potentially dish out. Interesting option if you wanted to dedicate one of your summoning points to it. Next up is Mana Virus. Injects target enemy with 10 stacks of a Mana Virus that slowly develops, adding 5 stacks per second and dealing increasing damage over time. When the virus reaches 80 stacks, the target explodes, dealing 200 chaos damage and inflicting silence on enemies within 3 meters. This skill has 2 upgrade paths. Mana Epidemic is going to inject the target enemy and all enemies within 6 meters of it when 10 stacks of the Mana Virus that slowly develops. And again, when it reaches 80 stacks, the target will explode, dealing 200 chaos damage. However, it will not inflict silence. The other option is Mind Virus, which does not inflict any damage, but it does inflict mind control for 20 seconds on the target. Mind control temporarily switches allegiance to the opposing team. This is an interesting option to use against bosses or really powerful characters that you are hard pressed to actually whittle down. It might be easier to just turn them against their other allies so that you can win the fight that way. And honestly, could be wrong, I haven't thoroughly looked through all the mechanics for the other 2 classes, but I swear this is the only skill I've seen that actually allows you to inflict mind control, so pretty cool all the way around. Next up is a passive, Self-Preservation. Each time you cast a skill, gain 5 HP regeneration and 2 mana regeneration for 5 seconds. Not bad to have if you've got additional passive slots, but nothing you need to prioritize either. Next up is Psychosis. Your attacks inflict Confused and Berserk. Same deal here. If you've got an extra passive slot, go ahead and throw this into there. Since you're using summons that are kind of just hanging around on the battlefield, there might be more situations where you're just using regular attacks because you're not ready yet to activate any of your regular skills. And then the final power for this specialization is Healer's Harmony. This skill is going to launch 6 helpful beams that heal your allies and 6 harmful beams that target random enemies, dealing chaos damage and inflicting one of the following statuses: slow, weakness, or silence. This skill has 2 upgrade paths. Healer's Peace is going to give you significantly more HP regeneration and attack speed. Healer's Fury is going to significantly increase the amount of chaos damage that is inflicted on enemies, and it's going to change the statuses that are inflicted upon them. They'll have Daze, Bleed, or Exhausted. Personally, I prefer Healer's Fury, and I think it's a great way to keep your allies healed up properly while at the same time dealing some solid damage onto enemies. And this is the basic layout of how I would build this character up. So as far as passes, we got the additional 10% maximum mana. We got the additional 25% skill power for 5 seconds when you cast a skill. The HP and mana regeneration when you cast a skill. And your manual attacks are going to inflict Confused and Berserk, especially since she's going to be using that two-handed staff to give her an even better chance of inflicting these statuses. I think that probably makes a little bit more sense for this particular build. As far as skills, she's gonna of course have Mana Shield. She's gonna have Medic Golem, which is gonna help to take away some of the damage she experiences as well. Mind Virus, just because I think it's really cool to be able to inflict mind control on an enemy. Fire Weapons, to give fire weapons to my rangers. And then finally, of course, Healer's Fury, which is an awesome way to be able to heal allies while damaging enemies. And that is my full overview of everything that Adept provides. Hopefully this gave you all some interesting information. I will definitely review the other 2 classes over the course of this next week. Hope all of you enjoyed this video. Take care.